I should I should let the audience come in, and then I'm then going to turn to Nick for further comments. And I know that we've still got coming an interesting perspective, which is not at all NIMBY-ish, on carbon capture and storage in Spain, and we've also got to have some kind of comeback on whether environmentalists are global in one respect or local and can't marry the two. But for you, the audience at this stage, what questions might you have of this political perspective that we've heard so far, which so far to me, it seems to me all to have been lots of positive noises and rather underplaying of the challenges. But any comment? Question? Carry on. Hit the microphone.
Never hit a microphone.
Thank you very much. I wanted to comment on the first thing that Ms. Herzog mentioned when she came on. She pointed out rightly the situation in Hungary and indicating that not in my backyard is something that in fact happens within the total industry. But
can I rudely interrupt and get you to say who you are and
yes,
where,
I want to come.
Okay.
Sorry, my name is Jan Koen van Elburg, and I'm executing the study that Ron summarized for us. And what is interesting, I think, is if you look at the cases of renewable energy, is that you need to make a distinction between compensation that comes from real health, safety, environmental issues, like with an aluminium factory, with a nuclear facility, with coal and steel, and benefit sharing mechanisms associated with renewable energy production. I don't see that much citizens or communities willing to invest in chemical plants. I do not say that we do not need chemical plants, that's another story. But I think that the distinction between renewable energy projects is really that you can make a strong use of the appealing, and I think you also refer to the high percentage of support that renewable energy projects can have, the appealing factor that they have, and the fact that there is, well, I would not say no, but almost no health, safety, and environmental issue involved. Maybe that's also the difficulty of carbon storage, because there is some. Well, a specialist will talk later about that. With wind farms, with most of the biogas projects, solar projects, it's not about health, safety, environment. One can even question, indeed, whether it's about in my backyard or not. It really creates an opportunity. So I think it's also important from the political side not to speak to about these kind of projects in a similar way as if these are aluminium factories or nuclear facilities.
Sandrine Dixon de Cleve, and I work for the Prince of Wales EU Corporate Leaders Group on climate change. On the 15th of July, the Prince of Wales hosted in St. James Palace a group of business leaders in the area of climate to talk about how we were actually going to put in place some very clear goals, visionary goals, in terms of meeting the climate change challenge. And his final call was that after all of the positive intonations that he has received, similar to what you've just indicated, that there are quite a lot of positive case stories, the fact of the matter is that there is still no real marketing plan, communications plan, as to how to demonstrate that this vision is actually very positive for global populations he was speaking about, but European populations in general. So I have two questions. One is, what is the role of creating, or the role of the Commission in trying to create a real communications plan with regard to meeting our 2020 and 2050 targets? What is the role of the member state in implementing that, and also the local authorities? And how do we actually translate that into some of the things that we've seen in Wallonia, which is that a continuous work with the population is what is needed to actually make this work. Because at the end of the day, we don't have a lot of time. So the technology is there. There's a great deal of openness from business to move forward in this area. But there's still a problem with NIMBY and with a perception from the public that this is all about cost on one hand, and also potentially about health and environmental issues.
I'm not going to get Ron to speak for the whole of the Commission just because a commissioner has disappeared. Instead, I'm going to take that as a cue for Nick to tell, in some ways, to give us some lessons that would tell the Commission, national governments and local governments what they should be doing.
Right, thank you very much. Actually, just on that point, I mean, it's an interesting one. Certainly in London, I hear, talking to some of the major NGOs, there is definitely the people are grasping for what this positive vision should be. So I think that's something that we should all be discussing amongst ourselves, rather than kind of more negative, we may go back to the 50s scenario. And I don't think it will be like that. So I think that's a very important thing. And on the marketing plan, the one thing I would say about that is the marketing plan is important, but it won't be sufficient on its own. I think nobody persuaded drivers to get out of their cars, to belt up with seat belts, or smokers to not smoke in public places just by communicating to them. You had to have legislation, infrastructure, other things. The two have to come together, so it's a kind of across-the-board thing. What I was going to say was to kind of reiterate a point that's been made several times, is that it's not just renewable technology we're talking about in terms of this issue. So one can think about the grid infrastructure question, CCS, the nuclear issue, whether you like it or not, is back there on the horizon. Natural gas facilities, in terms of we've had a very big pipeline across Wales, which is generated from Milford Haven into England, which has generated some serious controversy. So there are a whole range of siting issues attached to the decarbonisation of society, and I think the challenges are immense. And in a way, unlike before, they touch almost all of us in different ways. So all of those issues, alongside renewables, will encounter opposition and support. And we also forget at our peril that we can learn from citing controversies in the past. So it's not like renewables are entirely different from some of the issues we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years. So opposition to incineration, the mobile telephone industry have been kind of very proactive about engaging communities. And that very thorny issue about radioactive waste, which kind of has stuck, but it's kind of the paradigm worst case. So if you really want to go and look at the worst case, go and look at Yucca Mountain in America. And what has been written about that. But I think what's different now is the scale of change required, as I've said, and the point I made earlier about NIMBY may be an unhelpful term because the research says it's kind of interesting. It's quite, as I say, particularly with wind, and I think we've heard already. In fact, if you ask people about wind energy, they're very positive about it in general, and they're not entirely unpositive about it at a local level. So that raises a puzzle then. Why do some projects fail? Why does some opposition arise in relation to renewable technologies? Thank you. I'm just going to mention 4 possibilities that are in the literature and then finish from an academic perspective. And the first possibility, by the way, is there's much criticism that is purely an information deficit. We know from research on public understanding of science and technology that just telling people about the technology and how good it is will not necessarily work. In fact, what you often end up with is a polarized situation where some people become very opposed as soon as they find out about what nuclear is, and others become much more positive. So just saying the engineering side and the risk is low with chemicals or a facility or whatever is shown to be not an easy approach to use at all. So let's rule that out for a minute. We might come back to that though. So what are the possibilities? There's the possibility that at a local level there's a democratic deficit. It's already been mentioned. Those who object shout louder than those who are for a facility, and therefore you end up with a democratic imbalance. And that's kind of the evidence for that is mixed, but I think there probably are examples there. And what's the solution to that? Nothing straightforward, but you have to then think through, if you suspect it's a local democratic deficit, how would you strengthen local democracy? So that's either including wider voices, having local referenda. None of those are straightforward, but I think, again, it touches on one of the things which will come back time and time again. It's appropriate mechanisms for involving local communities. I think that's one of the mechanisms, not necessary for all circumstances. The second potential reason for opposition at a local level is that actually some of these technologies like wind, although the overall surveys say we're very positive about wind, if you ask people very carefully, they are actually only giving qualified support. So they like the idea of renewable technology, but there are potential problems in the background that people recognise. So again, if you do surveys that are carefully worded, you'll find out that people say, well, wind is very good, but it may not be reliable, the landscape may be impaired, and there may be too much of it. 10 turbines is okay, but if you're faced with 100 at the back of your farm, then you might have less of a positive view. Therefore, as soon as you get into a concrete siting instance, some of those kind of latent conditionalities pop up with people. So again, and I think those are in a sense entirely rational, and the response to those might be to change the people, so you've got to have a dialogue there to try to understand where those concerns are coming from. Or you could change the scheme. I think mobile phone mast siting has been one where the operators realised that there were some schemes that they just would not get through, and therefore they then talk to local communities and say, well, we're not going to have it here, maybe we can have it somewhere else if you need the mobile coverage. So you might need to change the scheme. The third reason that's been put is self-interest. And every siting, for some people, will resemble a classic prisoner's dilemma type situation where the collective good requires cooperation, but it's entirely reasonable for one individual to object to a local scheme which they might feel rightly or wrongly harms them personally. And the whole risk-benefit equity question comes into this. And it is not straightforward. There are always inequities in siting any facility that has some kind of perceived detriment at a local level. Now, the solution to that that's been argued, as we've heard again, is compensation. And a rationally self-interested being taking this kind of view should respond to a fair compensation offer. But actually then you're raised with the question, what is fair and how do you set that offer? And actually, and this may well help to explain one of the issues that's been raised already with the European research, compensation doesn't always work. And of course, it doesn't work when you're assuming somebody's after compensation, but actually they're objecting for the other reasons, right? So if they're objecting because of qualified support or because there's some kind of democratic deficit locally, then compensation may be less useful and may actually backfire. Some people will get actually quite irritated about that. So again, you've got to know the community to understand what type of process to put in place. Then finally, my final and an interesting social psychological phenomenon is a threat to place identity. Now, the concept of identity you can think of it in personal sense, that is, it's who I am and what I stand for. And that's a very psychological thing. It's how you are in your life. Well, that has been extended by environmental psychologists to take into account the place you live. And it's very surprising. People have very, very strong emotional attachments to the place that they live. To give you a small example, when you return home, probably you have a route. It might be a road or it might be through the airport. And there's probably some kind of big building, if you're coming from afar, from a long journey, that you regularly go past. And you probably get quite a positive response to seeing that building because, for me, it's currently it's Cardiff Cathedral, which stands out on the road coming into Cardiff. And that tells me I'm almost home. And therefore, I get a very positive response to that building. Strangely enough, some people who live near nuclear power stations and Sale have precisely that response. It's kind of interesting. So local threat to disruption of what people believe to be their local place and identity can be extremely anxiety-provoking for people. Cut off. This brings us back to participation in the process, that people who are concerned from that perspective have to be brought into a very key and deep dialogue with the developers and the political process. Thank you.
And does the research tell us anything about, picking up on your last point about identity, are there certain types of communities, perhaps those who have historically been in more industrial areas or perhaps even been in high carbon areas, is there a bunch of people who are going to be more accepting of low carbon technologies?
That's quite complicated. Colleagues and I and ourselves have been doing work in the north of England near Sheffield, which is traditionally a very high carbon area. And generally as an energy area, yes, there is more acceptance of both renewable and interestingly carbon capture and storage type technologies. But the one thing I would stress here is sites and communities are very different. So although there are generic lessons here, you have to be quite careful about the sites. And I'll give you another example. We've done a lot of work around, I won't name the site, a nuclear site in the south of the UK. And it's been pretty clear that the nuclear industry there has taken on itself over many, many years to be extremely nasty to renewable technology for very good reasons, because it's seen as in competition with renewable technology. And that's picked up by the population. So you actually find wind farms are thought to be much worse amongst that small group of people within the 10-mile radius of that nuclear plant, because they've talked to people in the pub about it. They've met people from the local plant. They have trust in some of the stuff that the operators say. There are the co-benefits that come from this facility. So it can be quite complicated, I think. Again, it's another example in South Wales. People have a very strong attachment to coal because of its mining history, and therefore coal is seen in a very different light from some of the other technologies.
I'm actually going to, at that point, go straight to Vincenti Cortes, because you've given me a good cue in.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think you have raised the point in the right time. I will explain very briefly our role, what we are, what we're doing, because our experience, I think, can be useful, not easily to be fully replicated, but can be useful. FEUDEN is a state-owned foundation created by the Spanish government with the first objective of stimulating the declining economy of a coal mining area. It was created 5 years ago, approximately. Our action lines were several, but always with the same target. First, promoting CCS. Second, promote the restoration of affected areas by the mining activity, and creating something awkward, the National Energy Museum in the Pilgrim's Way to Santiago, to inform about it. This is an area where coal has been the support for the economy for long years, now unfortunately declining. So we have been created as a non-profit organization. We are constructing, with the support of the European Commission, the largest ever oxycombustion experimental plant in the world, the largest ever. I will provide details when required. And we are, at the same time, starting activities to have an experimental site for CO2 injection and monitoring. We have done this job, of course, in a very good environment. It's a low-density area used to see how the underground is used for, let's say, commercial purposes. And, of course, looking ahead at CCS as a way of going on with the use of coal for the near future. Probably you know, in Spain has been very important, that the European Council has approved last Friday the state aids for using Spanish coal for power stations. So the bridge to have this coal utilization is CCS. So we have made specific actions to inform the public. We have already performed the 3D seismic survey in our site, and we will be injecting CO2 hopefully by the end of next year. But by the time, what we have perceived is that the population have received this action very positively, because these, of course, I recognize favorable conditions, but also because our actions have been based not on a business framework. Our actions has been based and is based on knowledge and scientific communication and rigor. So we understand that this case study can help, and in fact we are doing this job, to support industrial activities by helping to public acceptance of particularly storage on the CCS chain, which seems to be the more delicate aspect to be dealt with. But if we can provide, and we will for sure, support to industrial activities, we need from industry several requirements. First, that the information coming from them to be transparent. Second, could be accurate and reliable. Third, the action should engage local stakeholders, and already mentioned several times earlier, promote economic stimulus in the area. If these conditions are given, we understand that we, through our action, can help to promote and the deployment of industrial activities on CCS. But if not, we will suffer from a boomerang effect. Our action, our role, our prestige will be seriously damaged. We have not yet reached the target. We're on the track. We're working hard. But I think that hopefully we will find the right way of reaching the target we have been fixed for.
And briefly, do you think from what you've been hearing from Ron and from the others, is your experience of working with carbon sequestration, does it present any particularly different problems in achieving public acceptance?
You mean any particular problem related to?
In achieving public acceptance by the public?
Not exactly, because our focus is that we are preparing a lab, an underground lab, but this lab. So our goal is not injecting millions of tons of CO2, but hundreds or thousands of tons of CO2 to investigate how this CO2 is trapped, to investigate how this CO2 movement could be monitored, and how this CO2 can be followed up in this behavior on the ground. So we are seen as a lab to develop technology and validate technologies, not to make profit on it.
Andrea, I need the microphone back. Andrea, what do you make then of the challenge for the NGO world, moving in a bridge in some ways, perhaps even a ladder between the industrial world and civil society, and between the politicians and civil society? In that mediating role, what do you see as the particular challenges surrounding low carbon technologies?
Well, I think each technology has its own challenges associated with it, both technical and political acceptance. But just coming back to that last question that you posed to Vincent, actually I think CCS is different from some of the other technologies that we've got on the table, and I'll get into that and why I think CCS is different, and how each of the technologies actually that were put on the agenda today are different from one another. But earlier you posed a question about are we global or are we local? And I'm not going to let you get away with posing that without letting me respond to it. I think we have to be global and local, and we have to be true to ourselves in how we deliver our global visions and promises. And part of the problem, I think, with this debate is that we're starting on our back foot with NIMBY already. So in fact, when you're in somebody's backyard, you've already chosen a technology and a site and a way to implement it, and you're trying to convince them of the wisdom of your choice, and that is not the way to go about it. In fact, and you can throw economic benefits at people until they accept it, but they'll accept it for a time, and then eventually something will happen where they don't accept it any longer. The economic benefits don't outweigh the costs that they're incurring any longer, and then you're back in the same situation. So I must say I'm very much in agreement with Nick's insights that actually what we're talking about is building consent, which is a continuous process over time, which involves building trust through open and respectful dialogue with communities, that it allows for them to voice their concerns, whatever they may be, and bring their perspectives, whatever they may be, into the decision-making project, or into the decision-making about a specific project. So it's about dialogue, open and honest and respectful dialogue, and then you can start negotiating around the outcomes of that dialogue, bringing some of the tools that you're starting to develop in the commission through your paper. But don't start with the tools, start with the dialogue, and start with building an understanding of what it is that the community wants and expects out of a specific situation. And just to emphasize that views are not irrational. They're rational, but within a mindset of the people who hold those views. And not everybody has the same mindset. So they might look irrational to you as an engineer or as a chemist, but they're in fact very rational to the person holding those views. And there's a reason behind them. And the challenge is to get to the nub of that reason. And going into discussions with preset, prefab questions and answers, and I've seen this lots in my work, is not going to get you to a mutual understanding of perception and to solutions where you can both buy into the outcomes. And it will not create the kind of trust that you need to create to, in fact, negotiate between competing objectives and competing outcomes, because you will have to negotiate outcomes that are different from where either parties set out from them. And just to give you an example of a couple things that came to mind. In fact, I lived for a couple of years in Tolna in Hungary, south of Budapest by a couple of hours. In fact, south of the nuclear power plant in Paks. And one of the interesting things about living in that situation that I found out was that, in fact, the people of Tolna, many people of Tolna, like the nuclear power plant because it creates a warm stream coming down to their summer homes that sit on the Danube River just south of the power plant. Now, you can't know that sitting here in Brussels. You can't ever know that until you go to the town of Tolna and talk to the people and live with them and understand, look, this is where they're coming from. And that's where I think devolved power is very important, and devolved roles and responsibilities in terms of decisions about siting and location and how technologies are being put in the ground are very important, because people who live and work in places where technologies are being implemented are going to know these things, and they're going to know which buttons to push to make things work and which ones not to push to make sure that they don't work. It sounds as if the concerns about gas supplies is a similar story in the Vienna case of concerns about the cutoffs, and that could be a much broader community that you're talking about. But the point is, really take the time to understand where people are coming from. Don't go in with pre-cooked questions and answers. Go in with an open mind and open framing for the dialogue. And then if we go back to the three technologies, I think, and map on to those three technologies that we were originally talking about: wind, carbon capture and storage, and biofuels, which has come into the discussion a bit. I think we're actually looking at very different framing of the questions around each of those issues. With wind, I think generally people seem to be okay with the technology, but it's a conditional okay. They want it to be done the right way. So from our community, the perspective is, just avoid the migratory patterns particularly for bird species, and avoid habitats for bat species. We'll work with you on figuring out where those are and how to avoid them, and let's find siting solutions that work around that. With biofuels, it's really a question that goes a bit more fundamental. It's a question about, is this really the best use of a very precious resource that that we have of biomass coming off the land? Is this really the best option of how we use a very limited resource that needs to be used for food, for fuel, for fiber, for fodder, for everything else, that many other things that are irreplaceable to us and are central to what we need to have to survive? And with carbon capture and storage, I think it's both questions. In fact, it's both questions of do we really trust the technology, or two questions. Do we really trust the technology? And there I think we don't know enough about it or enough about the risks, and the industries that are promoting it have a reputation going back, and not so far back in the case of some of the deep sea drilling that we've recently seen, that, you know, what is the worst case scenario in that sense? And what are the measures that you need to put in place to manage those risks of the worst case scenarios? And can we trust you to put those measures in place, and have a discussion around that? I think there's a lot of convincing, or a lot of discussion that needs to be done, in fact, around carbon capture storage to understand what the real risks are, and whether or not we think we can cope with them.
And solar?
And solar again is it's the placement issue. So in general, yes, but conditional upon how and where it's done. I've heard reports on from some promoters of large-scale solar. Well, it's in the desert, nobody lives there, and nobody uses that land. Well, you know, actually, I would beg to differ, that there are very few places in the world where nobody uses the land. Engage with those communities who are using that land to make sure that what you're doing is going to have some benefit to them. So again, going back to this issue of costs and benefits, who wins, who loses, and how do you negotiate that trade-off? Then you can bring your tools to the table of, you know, compensation or economic benefit. But really taking a step back from this convince them approach, and understand where people are coming from when they express concern about a project coming into their backyard, so that you can understand how you can create a shared vision of, yes, in my backyard, an inspired vision of, yes, we need to have a different energy future, a better vision of an energy future, not going back to 1950s, but create that together rather than impose that upon people.
But maybe that's all very well for you to say, sitting in that splendidly decentralized federal country of Switzerland, but actually where people are, where Ron is, for instance, he's got a situation where the European Union has agreed on this 20% renewables by 2020 and all the rest of it. There's a top-down element there, and what we're talking about in some ways is that reconciling of the top-down with, yes, your vision of grow your energy mix from the bottom up, but Edith, energy mix doesn't get set by local communes in rural Wallonia, does it?